So this week we are moving into qualitative design. So just to review, qualitative design is research that is emergent, it is exploratory versus quantitative research, which is confirmatory, trying to confirm or reject hypotheses. So when you're thinking about qualitative design, you're thinking about research that is descriptive and conceptual instead of numerical. And it's analyzed using researcher interpretations like coding. And we're going to be talking about that in the coming weeks. So some of the research purposes that are consistent with qualitative design are to describe, to predict, or to explain, like non-experimental research, which we studied under a quantitative design. And some of the methods for collecting data with a qualitative approach are observation, interviews or focus groups, open-ended surveys, archival research, or analyzing videos and images. So when we're thinking about the 6 methods of data collection, here are some of the types that you will see with qualitative design. Now, quantitative design, you'll see closed surveys with scales, something that you can make numerical to analyze. Archival research that is using numeric data like test scores, demographic information, and then of course our experimental and non-experimental research. So when we start reading chapters 15 and 16, all about the different types of qualitative design, the chapter starts off by talking about some of the overarching characteristics that you will see with qualitative design. So it's a naturalistic inquiry. Instead of taking place in a laboratory setting or a more prescriptive setting, qualitative design tends to take place in participants' lives. So the research comes to people. It's emergent in that the design can change as the researchers are collecting data and creating the study. They might add some different data sources. They might make some changes, add participants, take some participants based on what they are needing, based on the particular methodology that they are imposing. And then, of course, the purposeful sampling that we've already talked about, where researchers are selecting participants based on people who meet a certain set of criteria that they are looking for. So if you are proposing a qualitative study, or once you are critiquing your qualitative study, look for how participants were selected. Are the researchers talking about who was included and why, and how they recruited them? Now, in chapter 15, they give a table that goes through the 5 different types of qualitative methodology that are covered in the textbook. There's many, many more, but these are the main ones that are covered in the text. So phenomenology, case study, ethnography, grounded theory, narrative inquiry. Those are the methodologies we are going to be reading about this week. And so here you can see the overall purpose of each design that you can use to compare and contrast. So in today's lecture, I'm going to go into detail, well, a little bit of detail about each of these types, and you'll be reading about them this week. But here, so the purpose of phenomenology is to describe the experience of some type of phenomenon. So and then a case study is to describe a case, or which is a specific instance of a particular phenomenon. Ethnography is a method to understand the cultural characteristics of an institution or a group of people. Grounded theory is a qualitative method that collects qualitative data and then finds about a phenomenon and then uses that data to develop theories about how people function in a particular phenomenon. And then narrative inquiry inquires into people's lives through using their lived experiences and stories to understand people's experiences. So when you're reading the text, you'll notice that the authors talk about the purpose of this methodology. They'll talk about the data collection that typically is associated with this methodology, what analysis looks like, and then what the final write-up looks like. And they do give some examples of each of these. And they also talk about the disciplines, a little bit of background about the discipline that these methodologies are derived from and where they originated. So in this chapter, in chapter 15, there is this table 15.1 that I think is really helpful that you can reference back to. So again, this is in the text, or if you want to take a screenshot of it here. So what I think is helpful about this table is it allows you to compare and contrast the different qualitative methods that we're going to be studying in this class. So here you can see phenomenology, ethnography, case study, grounded theory, and narrative inquiry. Here, the research purpose, where the disciplinary origin that I talked about, that I was just talking about, where it derives from, the primary method of data collection, the primary method of data analysis, and this is the focus of the actual research paper. So this will be helpful for those of you who are proposing a qualitative study. You can use that to align it with your research purpose, and then talk about the data collection that is appropriate, and then the data analysis that will help you with that. And then also when you're doing your article critique for the qualitative design, you can use this to help you as well for what to look for when you're talking about whether or not the methodology is appropriate for the research goals and methodology that they used. Okay, so the first one that we are going to be talking about and that you're going to read about in chapter 15 is narrative inquiry. So within all of these qualitative designs, there are many different subtypes associated with them too. So, of course, telling stories is a main component of this design. That is the primary mode of data collection, and the primary philosophical mode of understanding lived experience is through analyzing stories that people tell, either lived stories, retelling stories that already happened, or where the researcher relives a story alongside the participant. So in the text, there is a few paragraphs about each of these, so you can see some examples. With narrative inquiry, the authors do a great job. There's quite a bit written about narrative inquiry in our text. A great job describing about how, while many other qualitative methods use stories and narratives as one of their data collection approaches, narrative inquiry is unique in that it sees storytelling as a central mode to understand human experience. So with narrative inquiry, you will see not only so researchers will use interviews to ask people about their experiences in a narrative format. Before I get into that, I'm sorry, I skipped over one thing I wanted to say. So in the chapter 15 starts off by giving you some background information about some different epistemological approaches that researchers use. And the reason why they do this at this point in the chapter is because it helps you understand why researchers might use a quantitative approach versus a qualitative approach in terms of how they view knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy all about knowledge and making truth claims. So up until this point, when we've been reading about quantitative design, we have been making the assumption that was most closely aligned with positivism, the scientific method that we can derive truth by observation. But some qualitative research uses a positive approach as well, but many other qualitative inquiries use other epistemological frameworks to guide their inquiry. So as you're reading in this chapter, you will see structuralism and post-structuralism, modernism and postmodernism. And that background information will help you understand how qualitative researchers look for patterns and how they think that truth is best derived and represented about the human experience, in contrast with a positivist approach that thinks that there is one truth that can be derived through the scientific method. So you will see that in this chapter as well. And you can reference that as well when you are doing your article critique. You will likely see the authors include the theoretical and epistemological underpinnings of their study. That's much more common in a qualitative design. Okay, so we talked about narrative inquiry and then case study design. So the authors talk about what a case is. So a case could be a person, it could be a classroom, it could be a school, it could be a school district. And case study design is different from narrative inquiry in that it's looking at a case to try to understand something that could be generalized. So whereas narrative inquiry is just focused on that individual or group's experience through and understanding that through storytelling. Case study is trying to take a close look at one instance of something to try to make some implications about how this might be happening in other similar places. So in my dissertation, I used case study design. I was studying tax allocation districts. So this funding formula that is used to fund development projects around the city. So just for those of you who are in Atlanta, some examples like the Beltline is one, Atlantic Station is one. And so I picked one to study closely to try to understand how this worked that could be generalized to the other tax allocation districts across the city or other countries. So the authors talk about some different types of case study. It could be an intrinsic case study where you're trying to understand a particular phenomenon, instrumental case study where you're trying to understand if a particular aspect of something happening in a place is working or not. This is often used with evaluation research, and then a collective case study where there are more than one cases that are studied together to compare, see what's the same, see what's different. So a collective case study is you might be looking at 5 different schools and collecting the data in each of those and then studying within and across those cases to have your collective case study. So for the data collection for case study design, they often use more than one source of data collection. It could be interviews, documents, field some observations, and oftentimes case study design can also be quantitative, so or even mixed methods. So you can use a variety of sources of data collection, but the authors of our text talk about case study in the iteration of qualitative, although they do mention some of the quantitative interpretations as well. Okay, so then chapter 16 goes on to talk about phenomenology, ethnography, and grounded theory. So phenomenology is a qualitative research methodology that is concerned with understanding the essence of going through a particular phenomenon. So here you can see to describe one or more individuals' experience with a phenomenon. Now it's different from narrative inquiry. So narrative inquiry is understanding lived experience through storytelling. What's the same about them is they both use interviews. However, phenomenology is less concerned with this lived experience than understanding the essence of this particular phenomenon. So instead of understanding a person's lived experience, they hone down to maybe some of the examples in the text are like grief. There's one to choose from in the article, critique of a phenomenology of gifted students in a rural school. So somewhat like what is the essence of going through this experience? You could do a phenomenology of being a first-year master's student. What are of course, everyone's going to have different experiences, but are there common trends that most people who go through that experience? So the data collection is interviews. And then in analysis, the researchers are looking for those significant statements or themes that are representative of what this phenomenon is like. So in the final report, they will have description of the participants, the methods, and then what's called rich description. And this rich description in the findings is common in most qualitative approaches. So when qualitative researchers write up their findings, in quantitative design, researchers present the statistical analyses that they did and talk about the results and make interpretations and implications based on the findings from the statistical tests that they ran. In qualitative design, the researchers talk about the themes that they found and use what we call quotes or segments from the data to illustrate to give examples of how that point came up. So next we have ethnography, and ethnography came out of anthropology. And in my opinion, ethnography has a lot of complications in terms of ethics. Ethics is something that you will see quite prominently, or you should see quite prominently in qualitative research, because qualitative research has much more direct interactions with participants. So in quantitative design, you might do a quantitative study and you never interact with participants. Even if you're working with children, a lot of the examples that we looked at, they might be using test scores and using in ANOVA to compare test scores with another categorical variable, like maybe income level or years, like the number of minutes that they have with a certain educational curriculum. So the researchers are not directly interacting with the students. They are doing what they normally do. They are running their analysis based on existing data. But with qualitative design, unless you're analyzing documents, which is a type of qualitative design, they don't cover that so much in the text, but unless you are using documents, most qualitative design involves interviewing participants, observing participants. So it's much more close contact. So qualitative researchers have to be even more cognizant of ethics. And so, in my opinion, ethnography has a tumultuous history with ethics, because originally deriving out of anthropology, it was, and the text mentions this, that a big problem with ethnography is that it can be done from an ethnocentric perspective. And oftentimes in Western research, it's done from a Eurocentric perspective, where there's a history in anthropology of white researchers going to study people, oftentimes indigenous tribes in the rainforest or other parts of the world that they had little knowledge of. And the way that they studied it is through the lens of a Eurocentric perspective that it typically believes that their culture is superior. So a lot of those dated terms, and this is even in the text that I noticed, things like going native, a lot of those terms, I think are problematic because they do come from that ethnocentric perspective. But ethnography, when used in education, is to understand the culture of a particular place. So in order to do ethical ethnography, the researcher really has to interrogate themselves and make sure that they are not projecting their cultural norms and as superior to the culture that they are researching, even if it's like an educational setting like a school or a class. But the purpose of ethnography, and so I think that background will help you remember that, because anthropology is concerned with human civilizations, and ethnography is a research method to learn about culture and cultural characteristics. So in the text, they talk about macro versus micro. This is a typo. It should be micro versus macro culture. So there's even a type of ethnography called autoethnography, where you study your own culture. So it could be down to a very small instance versus a macro. Then the emic and etic perspective, we talked about that a few times before. So an emic perspective is kind of like a first person point of view. You've experienced it, you know what it's like firsthand. And an etic perspective is more big picture, a bird's eye view. So in the text, they do talk about some special types of ethnography. I think autoethnography is in there as well. So the data collection for ethnography, similar to case study, there are a variety of different types of data sources, mostly observation. So in traditional ethnography and anthropology, it has to take place, it's longitudinal in that it's at least a year. And oftentimes the researcher will immerse themselves in the research setting. And I'm going to show you some examples on the next slide where they might go to the school. If they're doing an ethnography of a school, they might go there every single day, all day for a school year. So participant observation is the primary mode of data collection for ethnography, where the researcher is there trying to oftentimes immerse themselves in the culture and constantly observing. They collect what's called field notes, where they are either memoing, recording, or jotting down notes about what they noticed, going home every night, analyzing, coming back. And then also with this method, informal interviews are common. So as you can imagine, if you're going to your research setting every day, you're going to get to know people, you're going to be talking to them. So interviews in that way, and then also collecting documents and artifacts that are representative of the culture. And then analyzing those field notes, the documents, the interviews, is how ethnography is analyzed. So this extensive field work. So in qualitative research, when you hear being in the field, that is when the researcher is in the research setting. So when you are writing a qualitative research proposal or analyzing a qualitative study, it's important that the researcher does a good job describing the research setting, what it's like there, where it's located, the demographics, just to give the reader of the research a sense of where it's taking place, because that makes a big impact on the data that is collected. So being in the field is where it's happening, and then field notes are the notes that the researcher makes when they are observing. And then lastly, grounded theory. Grounded theory derived out of sociology. So grounded theory's main purpose is to use qualitative data to develop theories about a phenomenon. And so the assumption with grounded theory is that researchers are trying to inductively generate a theory based on data that is collected. So they choose a phenomenon and they collect data, and then through a specific analytic process that I'm going to talk about in a moment, they are able to generate a theory about that phenomenon. So there's some examples in the article critique for you to pick, some things about like maybe being a woman principal. So perhaps the researcher would want to, they're interested in theorizing about what that is like, and so they might design a grounded theory study about it and collect data, and then through that particular analytic process come up with a theory for what that phenomenon is like. So with grounded theory, there are grounded theory, you will see the coding process, where they go through open coding, and we're going to get more into how to analyze qualitative data in 2 weeks, but open coding, where researchers read line by line the transcripts of interviews or the field notes, and they write short it's kind of like almost like a hashtag. When you're coding, you write a word or two that summarizes what they read. So they have open coding, axial coding, where they notice the patterns. And then they're able to go through and get to the theory. And then it's also called the constant comparative method, because as in grounded theory, as researchers are collecting data, it's an iterative process to where they collect some data, they analyze, and then they collect some more, analyze, and they're constantly building and adding on. And once they've gone through the coding process, they have a theory that they can share. Okay, so I wanted to give you some examples of qualitative research so you can see what this looks like. Now, I know that several people had mentioned being interested in critical race theory. One of the pioneers of critical race theory in education is Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings, and her dissertation resulted in what many of us know, culturally relevant pedagogy. And so that theory came out of a series of case studies that she did. So she wanted to understand the characteristics of teachers who were successful with African American children. So here you can see an excerpt from the one of the appendix of her book where she talks about her ethnography. So here you can see she used classroom observations. She put the dates, how long they lasted. She did 30 visits to each classroom and then did an additional 20 visits. So she had audio taped and written field notes. And then she talks about being a participant observer, a 3-year period, and taking notes in her notebook. So there's many different ways that qualitative researchers take the field notes. I mean, obviously, well, some people, I guess, use a notebook. I would certainly use my computer. But, sometimes people feel like bringing in a computer when you're observing is a bit intrusive. So that's something to think about if you are proposing that. So that is an example of how participant observation can result in a theory that has had a huge impact on all of us. And that's just a couple excerpts from her book, but if you are interested in, or if you have this book, you can turn to the appendix and read her methodology section. So another one of my favorite ethnographies is called subtractive schooling. And so this also resulted in a theory about the experience of Mexican immigrants who were attending high school in the United States, first generation versus third generation, and how the longer the length of time that students had been in the United States, how the US educational system impacted them, and how like in some of their experiences compared to their experiences going to school in Mexico, and the conception of education there. So in this ethnography, it took place over a year. The researcher was in the field every day. So some of the data sources, field notes, documents, artifacts, interview transcripts. And then when analyzing, looking for reoccurring themes or patterns. And I did make a note here, there are some other subtypes of ethnography that are not included in the chapter: performance ethnography and autoethnography. Okay, and so here I do have a little video of a researcher talking about a ethnography that she did, just to kind of bring it all together. So as with all qualitative research, the purpose is to understand people in their naturally occurring settings. So the data sources, field notes, interviews, documents. And so with an ethnographic method, the researcher immerses themselves into the context and then sometimes participates to understand a culture. So I will go ahead and play this clip for you. Okay. Let me pause. I have to install some software. Okay, that was quick.
So I naively asked one of my participants, "Why do you street race?" And he shakes his head and he said, "That's like asking, why do you read? People like different things. People always look down on racers because they don't understand the culture." It is my job today to help you all understand the culture of the Las Vegas streetcar scene through participant observations at car meets, 12 semi-structured interviews, and a content analysis of online forums, all coded with grounded theory. I was able to come up with 4 findings to help understand the culture and practices of the Las Vegas streetcar scene in order to understand the importance of scenes in cities. First, I found out that not a lot of the individuals are part of the car scene street race. In fact, most of them use the scene as a way to connect with like-minded individuals and as a way to escape their mundane day-to-day activities. I was speaking with a member of the scene when he said, "We're not in high school anymore, so it's really hard to find people who like the same thing." And a car scene does that for us. Next, I found out that these individuals have a strong, faithful respect for their scene's rules. Often on their flyers, you'll see the phrase respect the lot or respect the spot. This means no burnouts, no rev outs, basically don't do anything that may draw attention to the police. If this happens, some of the members will attempt to take a picture of the perpetrator, post it on their online forums, and essentially blacklist them from events. A frustrated individual was talking about this when he said, for some of us, this scene is more than just car meets. It's a family. This leads to my next finding, which is that there are strong familial bonds within the scene. Members of the scene, who are mostly men, will often address each other as brother. They'll bring their families and their pets to events, and when a member of the scene passes away, they have a candlelight vigil, or they'll host a car wash, and various other events to make sure that money for the funeral is taken care of. Finally, these individuals form deep connections with their cars. They spend a lot of time and money really personalizing their vehicles to personify themselves. I spoke with a member of the scene, and I asked him to describe the relationship he had with his car, and he smiled. And he said, "My car keeps me out of trouble. It takes care of me, and I take care of it. The car is an extension of us." So this scene really helps provide a sense of community in a city where community is often assumed to be vacant. And my research helps expand urban sociological scholarship by showing that scenes can serve as a communal proxy in large cosmopolitan cities. Now, my presentation may seem a little short, but if I get at least one individual, just one, to understand the culture of the Las Vegas street car scene, then I did my job. Thank you.
Okay, so there you can see a little example of what this might look like, and here's some of the terms you will see here. So yeah, I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And again, we will be going over how to analyze qualitative data in a few weeks, and you're going to get a chance to this week select a qualitative article that you want to review. So make sure you check that out in Perusal and sign up for the one that you are interested in. So please drop any questions about qualitative design in the chat, and I will get back to you soon. Bye.